Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you at the annual Sean Gabb Lecture organized by INES, the Institute of Economic and Social Studies. We've been holding a tradition of inviting Dr. Gabb since 2008, and I'm sure this will be surprising even for him. During the past more than a decade, we have covered plenty of topics, varying from cultural wars through ruling classes to limited liability of corporations. Today, Dr. Gabb will address a very actual and resonating topic, which is Brexit. As he knows, the newly appointed British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and some of the ministers from his cabinet, you will listen to the first-hand speech to this issue, which is often covered in Slovak media, but influenced by opinions of other big media players and opinion makers from France, Germany, or Brussels. Let me now briefly introduce our precious guest. Dr. Gabb is one of the most prominent British conservative intellectuals. He is the author of more than 40 books and around 1,000 shorter works. He also appears on radio and television and is a notable speaker at conferences and literary festivals in Britain, America, Europe, and Asia. He also advised to the first Slovak Prime Minister back in the early 90s. Under the name Richard Blake, he has written 12 historical novels. These have been translated into Spanish, Italian, Greek, Slovak, Hungarian, Chinese, and Indonesian. Under his own name, he has written 4 novels, and his other books are mainly about culture and politics. He also teaches, mostly at university level. His subjects include Latin, Greek, classics, history, law, and obviously economics. His first degree was in history, and his PhD is in English history. From 2006 to 2017, he was director of the Libertarian Alliance, and he's currently an honorary vice president of the Ludwig von Mises Center UK and director of the Center of Ancient Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Sean Gabb.
Well, what do I say after that? What I will say is, I'll begin by thanking Richard Durana and my other good friends at INES for having had the great goodness to invite me here again to give a talk this evening. And I'd like to thank you, my audience, for having come here on a rather hot and sticky Tuesday evening to hear someone talk about Brexit. Brexit. Brexit for breakfast, Brexit for lunch, Brexit for dinner, and now Brexit here from me. Now, the subject that I've been asked to talk about is whether the new British government led by Boris Johnson has a rational strategy for Brexit. Before I answer that question, I need to make an important reservation. I have known Boris Johnson for 20 years. I know several other ministers in the new government. This being said, I have no official or unofficial status within the British government. What I say this evening is not I am not speaking with any kind of endorsement, either official or unofficial, by any member of the British government or by anybody within the British state. I am speaking as a private individual who has closely observed the course of British politics for about half a century now. And so if I do say anything that is interesting and even true, it is my opinion, not necessarily the opinion of anybody in or close to the British government. Now that, again being said, I'll move on to discuss the strategy for Brexit of the new British government. This, so far as I can tell, has been seriously misunderstood. For example, Martin Fletcher is a senior editor at the New Statesman magazine and a former foreign editor at the Times newspaper in London. Last Friday, he published an article in the New Statesman in which he gave what appears to be the consensus view of the new government. This is that Boris Johnson and a small group of extreme right-wing ideologues have taken over the British Conservative Party and therefore at the moment the British government, and that they are driven by a burning ideological desire to leave the European Union on the 31st of October this year, regardless of the consequences. There is a small degree of truth in that. The truth is that yes, Boris Johnson and the British government really do appear now to be committed to leaving the European Union on the 31st of October, regardless of whether a deal has been reached with the European Commission. But the idea that this is a small clique of right-wing extremists is a misunderstanding, and I suggest it is a dangerous misunderstanding. The reason it is a dangerous misunderstanding, is that political extremists can be reasoned with occasionally. Sometimes they can be brought face to face with reality. They can be made to listen to the voice of reason. For example, in the early 1920s, the Soviet government in Russia had to listen to the voice of reason and suspend its various socialist economic policies. Now, if you believe that Boris Johnson and the new government are political extremists of this kind, you may have some hope that a compromise can be reached between now and the 31st of October, which will avoid a no-deal Brexit. But these people are not political extremists. These people speak, so far as I can tell, with the full authority of the British ruling class. There has been a 3-year debate within the ruling class on European Union membership, and that debate is now over. In order to explain the nature of this debate and why it is now over, I do need to explain something about the European debate in my country. I have been involved in the wider Eurosceptic movement for about 25 years. And I can tell you from my own experience, my own close experience of this movement, that the number of people in Britain who are particularly concerned either way about membership of the European Union is very small. The number of people who are obsessed by the details of legal sovereignty probably amounts to a few thousand. Even if it amounts to 10 or 20,000, we are still talking about a minority interest. The reason why Euroscepticism has become such an important force in British politics is because it is like a referred pain in a human body. For example, you have a pain in your left arm, it's shooting down your arm from your shoulder to your wrist. You go to a competent doctor. If the doctor is indeed competent, he will not give you a cream to rub on your arm. Instead, he will take out a stethoscope and listen to your chest. And if you are a competent analyst of British politics, when you look at the debate on European Union membership in my country, You do not start asking questions about what people think of subsidiarity in the regulation of the sheep meat sector. You will be seriously mistaken if you take that route. The reason why Euroscepticism has become such an important movement is that it is like a referred pain in a body. It is transferred opposition. Ever since about 1997, and you can trace it back maybe 20, even 30 years before then, but 1997, the election of the Blair government, it is a good opening date. Ever since about 1997, the British ruling class has been involved in a project of transformation. These people regard themselves as very enlightened people, so enlightened that they have the right to make us share this enlightenment by any means that they find convenient. Now, very large numbers of people in my country do not regard this kind of enlightenment as particularly enlightened in any normal meaning of the word. Oh yes, there will be a multicultural love feast in which billionaires and Muslims and transsexuals join hands and dance with joy. But this is a Potemkin love feast. There's nothing genuine about it. The world that many people in my country believe is waiting for us is one in which we will look out from the windows of our tiny, high-rise, rented flats, down at the streets where our rulers are driven about in bulletproof cars, while armed policemen push other vehicles out of their way. It will be a world in which the working class and the middle class will have been destroyed by managed flows of global trade and services. A world in which we shall have been atomized and therefore made incapable of resistance by managed flows of migration. Our rulers talk about love and equality and tolerance. All many of us see is a boot stamping on a human face forever, to quote George Orwell. It is either illegal or very dangerous to complain too sharply about this transformation in my country. But it is still an entirely open issue to have an opinion about the European Union. And so opposition to membership of the European Union has become a code for resistance to the wider transformation. In itself, membership of the European Union is remarkably unimportant. It is a free trade agreement with a customs and regulatory union bolted on. It has remarkably little direct influence over our lives. It is a notorious fact that the Polish and Hungarian governments do more or less as they please. It is also a notorious fact that the French government pays remarkably little attention to the Maastricht convergence criteria with regard to fiscal and monetary policy. As for Britain, we're outside the Schengen area and we are not members of the Euro. And so in itself, the European Union, many bad things about it, but those are not central issues to our national life. The reason why Euroscepticism has become so important is because, as I said, it is a cover, it is a code for resistance to the wider transformation. When the UK Independence Party first became prominent about 20 years ago, it was able to elect a few members to the European Parliament, which is an essentially meaningless and essentially powerless body. But in 2005, UKIP was able to help prevent the Conservatives from gaining majority of the English seats in the general election of that year. Certainly in 2010 at the general election, many people voted for the UK Independence Party who would otherwise have voted Conservative, and they denied the Conservative Party an overall majority in Parliament. It was necessary for the Conservatives to go into coalition with the Liberal Democrats in order to form a stable government. In 2014, UKIP won the European elections in Britain, won them by quite a wide margin. At this point, the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron panicked, and he went into the 2015 general election promising, if you vote for the Conservatives, we will give you a referendum on membership of the European Union. This was just enough of a promise to get the Conservatives a small majority. Even so, 3.9 million people didn't believe the Conservatives and voted for the UK Independence Party, which also came second in 120 constituencies. And so the European issue, for whatever reason, had become a big issue in British politics. I won't discuss the referendum campaign in 2016, except to say that the government mishandled it, it believed it would win, and in fact it lost. Now here we come to the great difficulty facing the British ruling class. Just as with us, the great majority of the British people, as far as the British ruling class is concerned, European membership is a peripheral issue. It is not. It is by no means a central issue. The British ruling class is far more interested in its transformation, and that requires control of education, the media, the administration, the criminal law, and the other main institutions of state. The details of membership of the European Union are not very important. Losing the referendum was a nuisance, not because these people are committed to European integration, but because they suddenly had to do something, that they suddenly had to sit down and work out the mechanics of leaving, and this took effort away from their main agenda. I will also add that there are a number of people in the ruling class who do like the European Union, who believe that it is a very good thing. And so, what did the British ruling class decide to do in 2016? The answer was, it would pursue a minimal strategy of Brexit. It would give us the smallest possible withdrawal from the European Union that would satisfy us, and it would continue with those parts of the European project that it found useful to its own project of British transformation. What went wrong was that Theresa May was made the Prime Minister. And what I'll say is that although Britain is not a particularly democratic country, in the sense that ordinary people do not have much, we do not have much control over how the country is governed, that there is no shadowy conspiracy, that there is no small central committee of conspirators giving orders and making sure that the right people are appointed to certain positions. It is a much looser conspiracy than that. And one of the weaknesses of, I won't even call it a conspiracy, one of the weaknesses of the transformation is that the formal institutions of the British state are much as they always have been. Power in Britain lies with the Prime Minister and with ministers of the Crown who are accountable to the House of Commons. And it means that if we get a Prime Minister who is a fool, there is not very much that can be done to remove that Prime Minister, and that was the case with Theresa May. Her job, her only job after 2016, was to deliver a withdrawal from the European Union that would just satisfy the people, that would shut us up, that would cause no particular disruption for those parts of the transformation project which is so dear to the ruling class. Unfortunately, she negotiated a withdrawal agreement that was so awful that very few people in the House of Commons, which is filled with some very trashy people, that very few people in the House of Commons were willing to be seen supporting it. Something that politicians still do not fully understand is that everything nowadays is published on the internet. A brief digression. When the Maastricht Treaty was negotiated back in 1991, it was published by the British government in an English translation, but it was a rather expensive book which you had to buy from Her Majesty's Stationery Office, and it was that thick. And even the ministers themselves didn't bother reading this treaty as they forced it through Parliament. Nowadays, everything, all agreements are published on the internet, and although this agreement was 585 pages long, several million people downloaded it and read it with close attention and realised exactly how unacceptable it was. An intelligent Prime Minister would have looked at popular discontent and would have done something else. You see, we may not have been that concerned about European membership, but we had been asked, do you want to be a member of the European Union? And we had said, no thank you. And so since the government had taken the trouble to ask our opinion, we expected that it would make some show of respecting our opinion. Instead, Theresa May treated us like fools because she was a fool. She tried 3 times to force this agreement through the House of Commons. Each time she failed, and well, that brought on a political crisis. And the crisis is this. At first, the crisis over Theresa May's withdrawal agreement only seemed likely to bring about the election of a Labour government. And many people in the ruling class do not like Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party at the moment for all manner of reasons which I don't need to discuss. But a Labour government is something that can be accepted and managed. Then Nigel Farage launched his Brexit party, and that brought on the true crisis. It began to move us towards what is called a crisis of legitimacy, where large numbers of people withdraw their consent from the main institutions of state. And this is something which has not happened in my country since 1641. The European elections of last June were effectively the second referendum that many Remainers had been asking for. And the Brexit Party won. It won a very large majority of the vote. And indeed, if you add the rather pitiful Conservative vote to that, the committed Leavers got more than 50% of the vote. Now, the Conservatives got a pitiful, I think, 8 or 9% of the European election vote, which is the smallest the Conservatives have ever had in a national election. and the Labour Party did very badly. And if we were to have a general election with the same voting patterns as we saw in June, we would not get a Labour government. Nobody knows what kind of government we would get. We have a rather strange electoral system, which is rather like a lottery when you have more than two parties taking part. But something we could be reasonably sure of was that there would be a large block of members of the new House of Commons which were for the first time opposed, explicitly opposed, to the overall project of transformation. It looked as though the debate on Europe had bubbled over into a debate on the transformation itself. And this is where Boris Johnson comes in. He is not a right-wing extremist who has unaccountably captured control of the British state. This is not an accident which can be undone by another stroke of luck. There is no point in hoping that he will be voted out by the House of Commons, or that he'll be made to listen to the voice of reason. The ruling class decided, so far as it decides anything, that in 2016 we would be given a minimal departure from the European Union. This was seriously mismanaged by Theresa May, and we must now be given a much more meaningful departure from the European Union. And Boris Johnson's job is to deliver that departure. If we leave the European Union with a good deal or with no deal on the 31st of October, it is very likely that British politics will go back to normal. The Brexit party will die, and the next election will be a contest between the Conservative and Labour parties, with the Liberal Democrats also saying, please vote for us. It'll be back to politics as usual, or at least that's what they're hoping for. And so Boris Johnson's job is to deliver a convenient Brexit, which must be a much more meaningful Brexit than was decided at the outset. And so there is no point hoping to persuade Boris Johnson that his extreme right-wing ideology is not appropriate, because Boris Johnson is not an extreme right-winger. There is no point hoping that more rational voices within the British government or the British system will overcome these right-wing extremists, because there is now substantial agreement within the ruling class that the people must be given a meaningful withdrawal from the European Union. Boris Johnson's job is to get us out. And that means something like a diplomatic triumph over the European Commission before next October, or leaving without a deal. And let me say that although, as I said, we have been members of the European Union for nearly half a century, and that means nearly half a century of economic and administrative and legal integration, and just ripping that apart and walking away, of course, will involve some degree of dislocation. But the dislocation is not likely to be as great as many people say, although I keep on saying these people are not right-wing extremists. They know their economics, and they know that a programme of tax cuts and repeal of regulations will offset most of the disruption, most of the short and the long-term disruption from leaving the European Union without a deal. In any event, even if leaving the European Union leads to a recession in Britain, that is a price the ruling class is willing to pay. The overriding, the supreme purpose of this new government is to stop the growing crisis of legitimacy in Britain. Now, I've mentioned a diplomatic triumph. What does the new British government want from the European Union? And I can explain that in a few sentences. What we want is to be outside. We want to be outside the customs union, outside of the regulatory union. We want to end the free movement of labour. We want to have absolutely zero accountability before the European Court of Justice or any other European Union institution. We want to be an independent, sovereign country with control over our trade policy, with control over our internal regulations and our tax regime, and of course control over immigration. If we leave the European Union on the 31st of October without a deal, do not suppose that Britain would continue to be a constructive partner of the European Union as it continues to exist. Britain is the only great military power in Europe. Britain is the home of Europe's only big financial centre. Britain is something like the 5th biggest economy in the world. We have close relationships with the Americans, with the Chinese, and with the Indians. And if we wanted them, we could have close relations with the Russians. If we want to be friends with the Russians, we can have it like that. And we have spent the last 500 years making life very difficult for anyone who has believed in a united Europe. And do not suppose that Britain, outside the European Union, without a deal, will continue to be any kind of constructive or even friendly partner. You are not dealing with the government of Theresa May. Theresa May regarded Brexit as a problem to be managed. She would have been delighted to get her withdrawal agreement through the House of Commons and to put the whole issue to bed. That failed. The whole strategy failed, and that strategy has been abandoned. Not just by the British government. British governments come, British governments go. It has been abandoned by a substantial and a growing proportion of the British ruling class. When Boris Johnson says we will leave on the 31st of October, you don't need to ask, is Boris Johnson truthful? Because he isn't. Is Boris Johnson a man of honour? No, he isn't. Boris Johnson means what he says because he has no choice. If we do not leave on the 31st of October, there is an unavoidable risk of a crisis of legitimacy, and the British ruling class has been asked to decide. You can give us Brexit and probably carry on with your transformation, which we still don't like, but you may be able to carry on with it, or you can deny us Brexit and we will withdraw our consent for everything that you do. And the ruling class has looked at the political arithmetic, it's looked at the repeated elections, and it's made its decision, and Boris Johnson is now speaking with the full authority of the British ruling class. And so, again, I have no official position, but if anybody is listening, all I will say is this. You can make the process of British departure from the European Union easy for us or hard for yourselves. The time for a compromise is over. Either we become a sovereign, independent nation, completely independent from any European institution, but with privileged access to the European market, in which case we should continue to be your friends, or we leave without a deal, in which case we may become rather unpleasant in ways that we have often been throughout the past 500 years. I hope I've been blunt, I hope I've made myself clear, because that's really all I have to say at the moment. Though of course, if you have any questions, I shall be delighted to try and answer them. Thank you.
If anyone has a question, please raise your hand, tell your name and ask the question loud so that everyone in the room can hear it. Thank you. Here's the first one.
Yes, Jan. I really enjoyed this talk. I found it interesting and entertaining. What I found astonishing is that during your 40 minutes talk, you mentioned the ruling class at least 2 dozen times.
Yes.
You mentioned the voters maybe 2 or 3 times, only in the context of voting for the Brexit party. The UK may not be a perfect democracy, but it's still a democracy. People do vote. It's not Jacob Rees-Mogg and other clowns who make the decisions. It's the voters who need to endorse these decisions. And the fact is, the UK is a very much a divided society. The electorate is extremely divided. Use the Welsh by-election, which I don't think that was a particularly fitting example, because the party that actually advocates a second referendum won, the Liberal Democrats. Why is, even if the current strategy of the government and Boris Johnson is in line with the preferences of the middle class, why is that important? What about the people at large? What about the electorate?
Okay. Modern democracy is a system in which the people are allowed to answer questions which are asked by the ruling class. Now, it's a better system than most, I can tell you that, but do not assume that modern Western democracy is a system in which the people get what they want. What about the majority for leaving the European Union? A great deal is said about the fact that the 2016 referendum produced a result of 52% to leave and 48% to stay, a 4% margin, which I agree is quite small. If you dig into those results, however, you will see that the English voted by about 66% to leave. The small overall margin only comes about if you add in the votes of the Scottish and the ethnic minorities. And for varying reasons, these votes do not really matter. The votes that matter on the whole are those 66%, or those 2/3 of the English. That is quite a large margin. My own voting constituency, Dover and Deal, is, there are very few ethnic minorities in Deal, and, well, there's only one Scottish person I know in particular, and we voted by about 70% to leave. These are big majorities. They're big majorities across England, which are regardless of social class. Deal, where I live, is a decidedly middle-class area, but Newcastle is a very working-class area, and it voted to leave by a large margin. Now, in 2017, although Theresa May ran a very interesting campaign, because it answered a question many of us have been asking. Many people have been asking, do campaigns actually have any effect on the outcome of an election? Many people said no. The voters make their minds up at least 6 weeks before the election, and the campaigning is just a matter of entertainment for the politicians. But Theresa May answered that question. She ran a campaign that was so awful that she turned a 20% Conservative lead into level pegging with a Labour Party led by an elderly Marxist. But even so, in the 2017 election, 80% of the voters voted for parties which promised to deliver Brexit. In the European elections of June, the Brexit Party won the largest share of that vote, and if you add to that the Conservatives, which did promise to deliver Brexit, even if it wasn't a very good promise, and if you add to that the Labour Party, which also promised to deliver Brexit, you are looking again at quite a large majority. And I take what you said about the Brecon by-election last week. It was won by the Liberal Democrats, which wants another referendum and wants to stay. But that's not important. What matters is... No, it's not important, because if the Brexit Party had not run a candidate, there were 3,000 votes which would almost certainly have gone to the Conservatives and given them a majority. And that's what matters to the Conservative government. Not the fact that the Liberal Democrats won that seat, but the fact that the Brexit Party prevented the Conservatives from winning it. If the Brexit Party were to repeat that kind of performance throughout the country at a general election, you are looking at a collapse of Conservative Party support, and there is no prospect of a rise in Labour support either. And so, as I said, there is a threat of a crisis of legitimacy, and compared with that threat, it doesn't actually matter if leaving the European Union without a deal brings on a recession or leads to a long-term lowering of British GDP growth. I don't believe it will, but if it does, that is a risk which the ruling class has decided it can manage. It can live with it. And let's face it, these people will always be able to pay their gas bills. It's the rest of us who will struggle. The gentleman over there in the shirt.
Yes, thank you. My name is Andre, and I was wondering, you talk a lot about legitimacy, and you said also that the European elections were something like a second referendum. What I was wondering about is that the turnout rate for the UK was something like 36.9%. So that's not a lot. How can you say, in which universe would that be the second referendum? And also, taking on to that, you can't really say that, well, only 36.9 people showed up because they don't really care about the European Union. Because in this country, the vast majority are in favor of remaining a member, and yet something like 23% showed up. So I was wondering, would it be, if you want to say that Brexit is something that legitimately the British people want, wouldn't you really need a second referendum now that it's clear what it's about?
Okay. The European elections were the nearest we shall have to a second referendum. If the British government does call a second referendum, there are just too many difficulties. There are difficulties about the question, and then there are difficulties, well, there'll be the fact that there may be widespread public unrest if a second referendum is called. You see, we are deeply suspicious. Every time European integration is rejected by a referendum, for some reason the referendum gets run again until the right result is given. And so it would be very difficult to run a second referendum in Britain at the moment. And the point is that we were asked 3 years ago, do you want to leave? We said yes. Well, we still haven't left, so why do they want to ask us again? And let's face it, the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, a woman of remarkable honesty, has said, I want another referendum. Fair enough. She was then asked, and so if the people vote to leave, you'll accept that? And her answer was, no, I won't accept it. So I suppose, logically, she will want another referendum after that, and then another one, and another one. And, sorry, we've been there before. We've seen it in Ireland, we've seen it in France, we've seen it in Denmark. No, we had our referendum, we decided, and that's it. Please can we have our will respected in this matter? The lady on the setting.
If people vote for fascism, would you accept fascism?
Now, what kind of question is that?
I think it's a
If the
It's
people,
It's a logical question from what you're saying.
let me repeat your question. If the people vote for fascism, would I accept fascism? The people didn't vote for fascism in 2016. We voted to leave a customs and regulatory union.
And you say we when the country just split in two. And I personally live in London, and I don't really meet too many people who voted for Brexit.
Well,
The
lucky
ethnic
you.
minority who voted for Brexit.
Yeah, like Scottish and Irish. Calling Scottish and Irish ethnic minorities is the most racist thing I've heard.
Ah, you didn't hear me properly. I didn't call the Scottish an ethnic minority, and I didn't mention the Irish.
I think if you watch the video,
No,
you
I
will
refuse
find
to answer your leading question. The implication of your question is that wanting to leave the European Union is some part of a fascist project. I find that deeply offensive. You may have lived in London, but you don't know England. Next question. Sorry, the gentleman there. Yes, please.
No, ja mám pocit, že ľudia vo Veľkej Británii sa rozhodovali v referende na základe nepravdivých informácií. Chcem sa spýtať, že či bola pred referendum vypracovaná nejaká dopadová štúdia o dôsledkoch referenda a ak bola, teda ak nebola, prečo nebola, ak bola, prečo sa nedostala k obyvateľom Veľkej Británie a ako je to s informovanosťou občanov Veľkej Británie o dôsledkoch Brexitu teraz. Či sú už informovaní o dôsledkoch Brexitu.
I got bits of it. Okay, the implication of the gentleman's question is that we did not vote in 2016 with full information, and that we might change our minds in a second referendum if we had full information. The difficulty with that is that we live in a world of bounded rationality. We do not have full information, and the information that we have been given about the effects of leaving the European Union without a deal are problematic. Nobody knows what would happen. It might lead to traffic jams all the way from Dover to Birmingham. It might lead to a second economic lift-off for Britain. It will probably be something in between. We don't know what would be the economic effects of leaving without a deal. We don't know what side deals would be available. We don't know what offsetting policies the British government could bring in. We also don't know what will happen to the international economy, which is probably a great deal more important to us than what happens in the other states of the European Union. And so the idea that there is some platonic truth out there about the effects of leaving the European Union is, I'm afraid it's a pleasing fantasy. We don't know. All that I can say is that we were asked, do you want to leave? We said, yes, please. And during the 3 years that the government has continued not to deliver on that, large parts of the British public has become radicalised. And it is not a question of respecting the will of the people. The British ruling class has absolutely no interest in respecting the will of the people. It is a question of avoiding serious unrest and the crisis of legitimacy that I've mentioned. And so that is why these people are pushing for the 31st of October. It's no longer a question of democracy, although they talk about it. It is a question of avoiding a much deeper crisis. And as I said, if leaving the European Union puts us into a recession, well, it's a recession. Recessions come, recessions go. At the very least, if there is a recession, the politicians can throw their hands up and say, it's not our fault, we gave you what you wanted, so I'm afraid you'll have to live with it. They're perfectly capable of doing that. And as to what do I think will happen, my answer is, I haven't the foggiest. I don't know. The gentleman there in the front. Yes?
Dr. Goetz, I'm David Kožuta. I would like to ask you, we have some similarities, but maybe almost none with the UK, but we have also the suffering north of England, which was really revolting to read. We call it some regions which are a little bit far away from our London, which is Bratislava. And we also tend to accept Bratislava as a conglomerate of many people from outside Bratislava as well, which are well positioned, which are well educated, which are well aware of the affairs. So what I would like to say is that I favored the opinions of Bratislava electorates. Usually it's different from the rest of the Slovakia, especially from the east, because our north is in the east actually. So I've lived in London 2016 and I really can only just confirm that London didn't vote to leave. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, what is London to UK and to England especially, and can you come back to this ruling class? These people are these like hundreds of years people who are ruling the country, or who is the ruling class and how many people are there? Because we have a ruling class, we call them the oligarchs or the owners of the country. and it's few of them. It's like 50, okay? Yeah. So how many is the ruling class in UK?
Right, okay, the ruling class. When I talk about the ruling class, I'm not talking about landowners in top hats who live in big houses and whose ancestors have had titles for the past 800 years. When I talk about the ruling class, what I mean is a loose group of educators, lawyers, administrators, politicians, and associated business interests which derive income and status from an enlarged state. And so in this sense, the Archbishop of Canterbury is not really a member of the ruling class, but the Director General of the BBC most certainly is. But coming back to the question of whether the opinions of the more educated and enlightened people in the capital should prevail over the opinions of the less educated and much less enlightened people elsewhere in the country, let me put this to you. Let's suppose that in Slovakia you had a debate on euthanasia. That is the mercy killing of people who are very ill. There are good arguments either way for this, and I won't take a position on it. But let us suppose that the people, the educated and enlightened people of Bratislava thought about it and said, I think perhaps it would be a good idea if people who were suffering from terminal cancer could ask for an injection to kill them. I think that would be a very good idea. Well, that is an arguable proposition. But supposing the unenlightened and uneducated people of Košice and Poprad voted against this and were likely to riot in the streets and burn down government buildings if this law were to be brought in. In that kind of situation, the voting figures don't matter. It doesn't matter if 52% of Slovak people vote for this law and 48% vote against. As far as the people who rule Slovakia is concerned, if you do not have this law, the people in favour of it will not burn anything down. if you do get this law, you will have continuing troubles in Poprad and Košice. And so in this case, democracy doesn't matter. It is not just the number of people in favour of a particular issue that matters, it is the passion with which those people hold that position that matters. And it's the same in Britain. If we leave, as we probably shall, on the 31st of October, there will be no rioting in Britain. If we don't leave, there might be. And that's all that matters. As I said, if it brings on a recession, it brings on a recession.
Yeah, my question is about one, I think, a very important context of results of referendum on Great Britain about Brexit. And my question is, do you admit any kind of external influence to the results of referendum on Brexit?
Yes.
Relevant.
Oh yes, was Mr. Putin sending checks to people?
Not only him, but including him.
Look, in almost every election, in virtually any national election nowadays, there are always outside interests. The Americans doubtless give certain help to candidates in European elections. The Americans have a long history of interfering in other people's elections. It may be that it does seem to be the case that the European Union gives a great deal of money to the BBC, and I don't think that that is completely free of strings. And I have no doubt that the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and God knows who else try to have some kind of influence over elections in Britain, in France, in Germany, and in America. But the question is this outside interference sufficiently great to distort the overall result? And it's very hard to think of examples of elections which have been fundamentally distorted by outside involvement. I suppose the answer to your question is I don't know, and I don't much care, because if there is any foreign influence, it probably doesn't mean that much.
I mean, the difference was 1.6 million.
Yes, but
So is 800,000 people influenced by Cambridge Analytica style impact?
well,
Is enough disruption, or is normal?
no, I don't think. Look, Facebook is Mark Zuckerberg is doubtless enormously pleased with himself. He boasted last week that he helped change the result of the Irish referendum on abortion by not allowing the anti-abortionists to run campaigns on Facebook. If Mark Zuckerberg's interference in the Irish referendum on abortion changed the votes of more than 500 people, I should be very surprised. If you are one of the richest men in the world and people are shouting at you that you have a controlling effect on elections, you will come to believe that you do have that controlling influence, but it's very hard. It's very hard to see what control these people do have. I wouldn't lift a finger to prevent outside interference in elections, to be honest. Oh, if you could show me an overwhelming case, then there might be an argument, but I haven't seen that case.
US election?
The reason Donald Trump won the election in 2016 was because 60 million Americans listened to his message and thought, I like the sound of that. Whatever you think of those 60 million Americans, that's what they did. I don't think that Mr. Putin managed the campaign. The gentleman in the shirt again.
Yes, thank you. One caveat to that, I was in the States at the time, and actually Trump lost by about 3 million votes. So the vast majority of America is actually against it in those elections, but that's just as an aside. I was wondering, however, if Brexit leads to the independence of Scotland and Northern Ireland, or reunification, would you say personally that it's a price worth paying for having Brexit?
Let me, the question is, if Brexit leads to the breakup of the United Kingdom, would I think it a price worth paying? Let me give you a roundabout answer to that question. If Scotland is so weakly attached to England that membership or non-membership of a customs union decides whether to stay or go, then I think it's better that they should go.
Will you let them go?
Of course, of course. If the Scottish people vote in a referendum to leave the United Kingdom, they will leave the United Kingdom. That doesn't mean that they will be free of England. Until 1707, the most important man in Edinburgh tended to be the English ambassador, and an independent Scotland will probably find that the English ambassador, or whatever you want to call him, the English High Commissioner, is an important player in Scottish politics. But
Is that what happens in Ireland? Is that why they dropped the currency, introduced the metric system, joined the EU, the EMU and everything?
until 1973, Ireland was a very loose colony of the United Kingdom. It hasn't been such a colony since, but the debate in Ireland at the moment is how best to respond to a United Kingdom unconstrained by the institutions of the European Union. But you see, I'm not Irish. I don't have any particular knowledge of what's going on in Dublin, so I can't comment on that. But let me come back to the gentleman's question. It's a leading question. Do I think the breakup of the United Kingdom is a good price for Brexit? The real answer is that if the Scottish are so loosely attached that membership of the European Union decides whether they stay or go, then really they have no business staying. A union of peoples should be about far more than short-term economic convenience. It shouldn't be a question of what are you going to do for us? Oh, we don't like that, we're going. Well, if it's like that, go. Now, this kind of debate took place here in this country about 30 years ago, and we're now living with the consequences, which haven't turned out too badly. The lady in the pink dress.
Thank you, and thank you for your interesting talk. It's good to hear a provocative exposition sometimes, and to stimulate debate. And there are lots of things that I would not agree with you on, but leave that aside. I would agree that you're right in that Boris Johnson is determined that we will leave at the end of October with or without a deal. However, I would take issue with your final point in summing up, is in that your assessment that the UK will be determinedly unfriendly to the rest of the EU if we leave without a deal. I just don't see that. We will always be neighbours. The government has already said unconditionally that they will guarantee the rights of EU citizens in the UK. That's not the act of an unfriendly government. I think our economic ties, our bilateral ties will endure, and I think we would agree that the British are a pragmatic sort, and it's not in anybody's interests to pick a fight. You say that we have other international interests which might take precedence, but at the end of the day, the economic links with Europe are larger than with anywhere else. So that's my comment on your final.
Yes, of course. The idea of open unfriendliness is hard to imagine, but when you get to the level of high politics and the avoidance of crises of legitimacy, then you're talking about power relationships, and what happens behind the scenes is not always very pleasant. Of course, I personally have every interest in a continuation of excellent relationships between Britain and the remaining European Union. My wife is Slovak, my daughter is both English and Slovak. I find it very convenient that I can come visa and that my in-laws can come to England without a visa. I personally would not like any degree of unpleasantness between my country and the European Union. The difficulty is that once Britain is outside the European Union without a deal, if there is any degree of inconvenience that attends our departure, then you will find that the people who matter in Britain will feel a certain resentment, and provoking the resentment of the British ruling class, I would suggest, is not a good idea. In a minute, does anybody want to ask a question he hasn't asked one yet? The gentleman there in the sort of whitish t-shirt. That's the one.
My name is Jan, and I have maybe more of a technical question. You know, at the moment we've got a Brexit government, but more of a Remainer parliament. And what I wonder is that if at the end of October it is not actually the parliament that could step in and in face-to-face no deal, that the parliament would actually blackmail both the European Union and the British government that it would revoke the Article 50 if they don't sit down and if they negotiate a deal. That if it's actually in the competence of the parliament, of the government itself, the revoking of the Article 50, that's what I wonder about.
Okay, the reason I'm smiling is that you've just raised a possibility which I don't think anyone else has thought about in England. The possibility that we'll tell the Europeans, give us what we want or we'll stay.
Yeah, I get it.
Yes. I'm sure that would terrify people of Brussels. Okay. During the past 6 months, we have been revisiting constitutional territory last looked at in the 1640s, and I don't know what the system will allow in the technical sense. As things stand, Parliament is currently in its summer recess. It's on holiday. It comes back near the end of September. At that point, it is possible for the leader of the Labour Party to move a motion of no confidence in the government. But you see, why should the leader of the Labour Party move a motion of no confidence in the government when it's likely that Labour would lose 50 or 60 of its members in the next election and bring on a political crisis that would bring no benefit to the Labour Party? But let's just assume that the Labour leader were to move a motion of no confidence. I'm not sure that Boris Johnson would lose that motion of no confidence. And if he did lose it, well, we're not quite sure what happens. The Fixed Term Parliament Act 2010 is rather vague on this. If the government loses a vote of no confidence, 14 days are given for a new government to form. If no new government can be formed, there will be a general election. But we're not quite sure what that means. It could well be that Boris Johnson will just refuse to resign. Nothing in the Act says that the government must resign. It could be that before a vote of no confidence, or after losing a vote of no confidence, Boris Johnson could close Parliament down. The technical term is prorogue. It simply needs a piece of paper signed by the Queen, and Parliament is shut down until further notice. And this is a matter of the royal prerogative. the Queen's action in proroguing Parliament cannot be contested within Parliament or by the courts. The Queen is above the law. And so we don't know what will happen. It may be that the House of Commons will try to pass a resolution saying this House will not be dissolved until such and such a time, which I believe Parliament did in 1641, just before the Civil War. But I think we've had enough of constitutional antiquarianism for 1 year. It is likely that nothing much will happen in September, and there will be frantic discussions behind the scenes in Brussels and London. And I still think the most likely outcome is that some kind of deal will be agreed. However, ask any estate agent. If you want a good deal, you have to be prepared to walk away from a bad deal, and that could be what Boris Johnson's up to. It's just that the deal, any deal agreed, has to be a good one. It has to be a great deal better than the one that Theresa May brought back. And if, for any reason, our European partners are unable to agree to a better deal than Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, then we enter the completely unknown territory in international relations of a departure from the European Union, and in British politics of, well, whatever happens next. The gentleman in the blue stripy shirt.
Let's imagine that in referendum 2016 the question was posed differently. Either you can choose leaving without a deal, or you will have, or you remain. The second scenario would be no deal Brexit and the deal that is currently on the table. Do you think that if in any of these two scenarios would remain vote, or would Brexit win?
I don't know. All I can say is that when you run a referendum, fairness requires that the question should be simple. There are people talking at the moment about another referendum in which you have 5 or 6 options on the paper: leave without a deal, revoke Article 50, leave with this kind of deal, leave with that kind of deal, whatever. Running that kind of referendum would be logistically impossible, and it's very likely that no one would accept the winning outcome. And so when you hold a referendum, fairness does dictate, whatever your side in the issue, that it should be a yes or a no answer. Back in 2016, my own preferred withdrawal agreement was one in which we remained in the European Economic Area but left the European Union, which would give us a great deal of practical independence in setting out trade policies. It would not make us directly accountable to the European Court of Justice. We could have insisted on an opt-out from the freedom of movement clauses, and we would have been subject to a number of European regulations and had reasonably open access to the European single market. And the great failure of Theresa May is that she has poisoned the waters. Anyone who suggests what I still regard as an entirely workable and fair solution to the problem is now seen as some kind of traitor. And so either we leave with a diplomatic triumph of the sort I've mentioned, or we leave with no deal at all, or we enter a crisis of legitimacy in which a large number of people, and it doesn't have to be a majority of people, think of what I said about the euthanasia debate here, we enter a territory in which a large number of people withdraw their consent from the British state. And that is something that people want to avoid. that's why there are many people now who voted to remain in the referendum and are now saying, get the thing over and done with. It's gone on too long.
Thank you very much. I am happy to see you again. I have been to one of your lectures at INES a few years ago. And well, before I pose my question, I would just like to say that I may try to cheer you up. I'm a fan of Brexit, I'm a fan of Boris Johnson, and in fact Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was vilified even today here. And I think that there are many people who misunderstand or willfully misinterpret what they try to say. And I have studied in Glasgow, and every time I mention I'm a right-winger, I was called a fascist already then, so I'm happy to see that those things have not changed since then. Maybe that's why I take it so personally. The question I want to ask, and it's a question which you may not have addressed yet, but when UK entered the EU, the party that sort of talked about the EU referendum and offered the first one was the Labour Party. So basically it was the left that has proposed sort of some complaints about the EU. Since 1990s it had become a Tory talking point. And if you look, basically when the Labour moved to the liberal, metropolitan, intellectual, you name it, elites, basically it led the traditional Labour voters for not just Farage to sweep them up, for them to again call them fascists, just because they don't like what their new policy is. How much do you see the current situation as a failure of the Labour Party? Maybe what's the position of Corbyn in that, because he has switched his position so many times. And whether do you think there is a chance that he would be toppled in this sort of situation, so that the Labour Party would actually join the Remainer camp, or you think this is no longer an option for them, or what do you see the situation as?
I'm a conservative, a very strong conservative, but I do have a great deal of sympathy for Jeremy Corbyn, and often for what he says. There is something broken about our system of government, and at least he's coming up with a few solutions. He also is not a neoconservative, and is opposed to the endless wars of aggression that we enter or cheer on, and so I do have some time for Jeremy Corbyn. I also appreciate that he has, throughout his entire political career, believed that we should leave the European Union. However, let me come back to a question. The Labour Party has abandoned the working classes. The Labour Party traditionally was about improving the lives of ordinary working people. Its means of doing this were rather bad. It involved the state ownership of the means of production, and, well, we've been there, haven't we? More recently, the Labour Party has given up on the working classes in favour of a rainbow coalition of all sorts of real and imagined minorities. And so you can say that the Labour Party does not represent the working classes. However, the Conservative Party is supposed to be about conserving the fundamental institutions of the British state, and also promoting the interests of entrepreneurial middle-class people. What you actually see in Britain is that both main parties, Labour and Conservative, are quite happy to talk about political correctness and to do business with big global corporations. That's why when Tony Blair won the 1997 election, there was no visible change in economic policy. And when David Cameron won the 2010 election, there was again no visible change in economic policy. But there is a British politician called George Galloway, a rather left-wing Labour politician, and he once described the Conservative and Labour parties as two cheeks of the same arse. You have the left cheek and the right cheek at the same bottom, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. It doesn't matter whether you vote Conservative or Labour. You get politically correct corporatism tax breaks for the super rich, and a very raw deal for the middle and working classes. How many questions do you think we have, Richard? The gentleman there who keeps wanting to ask questions.
Yes, Jan Finland again.
Yes.
You talked several times about the political triumph that you hope Boris Johnson will deliver. And I'm just wondering, why do you expect Boris Johnson or anyone to be able to achieve this kind of a triumph? Basically, it's a classic case of cateism. Why would the EU deliver this kind of a triumph to the UK when it's dealing with a small, insignificant country that hasn't achieved anything of importance in the last 200 years? We're talking about a large economic bloc dealing with a small country, and on top of that, this bloc has an incentive to make an example out of the UK, or England for that matter, to make sure that other countries don't follow this kind of example. So you're talking about the deal that you would like to get. You actually want to even get the WTO deal because you're not a member of the WTO. And we, Europeans, can vote against you becoming a member of the WTO. So we can have good relations with Scotland and the Irish and make your life difficult, just like you threaten, well, not threaten, but point out to the possibility of making our lives difficult by having good relations with the Russians, Indians, and Chinese. But again, why would the EU negotiate with Boris Johnson and anyone else? The Irish Taoiseach has more leverage than Boris Johnson at the moment.
Okay, I don't understand your point about Britain as an insignificant small country that's achieved nothing important for the last 200 years. If you said that, I'll take it as satire. You have, however, made a very good point about why should the European Union give Britain this diplomatic triumph I've mentioned, in which we have all the benefits of being outside the European Union and none of the costs. We have all the benefits of being outside and all the benefits of being in as well. There is a very good reason why the European Commission and the European Union as a whole should reject this demand. And the reason is that if we get it, the Poles will doubtless be asking for it before the end of the year, and then the Hungarians and maybe the Dutch. And that will cause difficulty, shall we say. And so it may well be that no deal is available and we'll have to move towards a no-deal agreement. But what I would say is that although the European Union collectively is a wealthy trading bloc, it doesn't have the kind of leverage that you'd expect from an economic entity of its size. The European Union is institutionally weak, and in this kind of dispute, where you have a reasonable degree of unity in a small contestant and a rather large and diffuse but richer other contestant, the contest does not always go to the apparently stronger side. So we have very little respect for the international leverage of the European Union. And let us face it, why should the European Union try to veto British membership of the World Trade Organization? Why? They won't.
Why wouldn't they? Just like you said, the UK might, the departure on non-friendly terms might be too adversary.
UK is a member.
UK is not a member.
Yeah, it is
the
member.
EU is a member.
Every country was member before.
The EU is a member of the WTO.
Look, what we're doing, the debate is the UK is a member of the World Trade Organization. No, the UK is a member of the World Trade Organization through the European Union. There is a degree of doubt about all of these things. We're not sure whether we are, in our own right, members of the European Economic Area. Some people say that we're members by virtue of our European Union membership. Other people say that our signing of the original European Agreement makes us independently members. These are very interesting matters which may one day make international lawyers a great deal of money, but they don't have any bearing on the raw politics of the matter. But any more questions?
Yeah, we'll ask one.
Okay. Dr. Gebb, so a little bit of geopolitics. You mentioned many times that UK over the ages was independent and very strong, which is of course true. Very heartbreaking to see you go. It's also true what my English friends confirm about my Scottish and Irish friends saying about English. That English have only no friends, but no enemies, but only interests, which is absolutely okay. Geopolitics. European Union as a united universe is very threatful to Russia because of the liberal democracy which is flourishing within it, which came from it, where massive portion of that contribution was coming from British soil and history. And for the US, it's another threat economically because it's another enemy together with China and India. So it's absolutely obvious that what you said, that not only Russians but also US was interested in falling apart of this project, which is a threat to Russia as a concept of liberal democracy and unity, and for US as economical threat, because European Union was ever since thriving, ever since they came to this project. So you leaving is fine. You said with one strike of the fingers you can be friends with Russia. So considering all this geopolitics, you will leave the EU. Maybe you will not have such a strong ties anymore to the continent, but who do you favor as your connection? Is it the Russian influence, or it's just a matter of polite politics and cold friendliness, or is it US? How do you see your position after leaving this club?
Let me give you my personal opinion, which is obsolete. I believe in a European Union. We are a single civilization with enormous common, or at least overlapping interests. I think the European Union of Juncker, Macron, May, Merkel is a thoroughly evil organisation. However, my opinion doesn't matter in the overall view of things. What does matter is that for the sake of internal political stability, the British government has finally agreed that we must leave the European Union on the 31st of October. It is looking for a deal which will be acceptable to the more excitable members of the British public. If it can't secure this deal, and I accept the gentleman's point that the European Union has no particular interest in giving this deal at the moment, if we can't get this deal, we shall have to leave without a deal. But the point I'd like to carry away is that without calling Boris Johnson a strong or an honourable or even a particularly clever politician, you are not dealing with the kind of government that was led by Theresa May. A government which accepts that the referendum was a terrible thing and we must find some way of smothering it with a Brexit in name only. You are dealing with a government that would doubtless like to do the same as Theresa May tried to do, but which accepts that it no longer can do so. We have to leave the European Union for domestic political reasons. And so it would be a very good idea if there are any influential European politicians listening to what I've said, to sit down and to ask how can we actually sort this out in a way that Britain leaves the European Union on terms which allow us to remain friends in the long term and which may even minimise disruption in the short term. To continue insisting that the withdrawal agreement negotiated with Theresa May is the only deal on offer is, I'm afraid, to guarantee a British departure without a deal. Let me say again, Boris Johnson and the new government are not a group of right-wing ideologues who must somehow be broken in to see reason. These are frightened politicians. They have looked over the depths. They have looked into the depths of the abyss which has opened up in British politics, and they are stepping away from it. They may not want to leave the European Union, but they believe that they have no choice in terms of domestic politics but to leave the European Union. And as I said, insisting on Theresa May's withdrawal agreement is beside the point. It is dead. It cannot be accepted. It doesn't matter that there are many people in Boris Johnson's government who are in Theresa May's government who may even have helped negotiate this. It doesn't matter that Boris Johnson voted for it at its third bringing into the House of Commons. It doesn't matter. The withdrawal agreement is dead, not because Boris Johnson thinks it is in itself a bad idea, but simply because it is unacceptable to an important section of the British people. And so what are we going to do about this? Well, that is the question. Now, my answer is that either we leave without a deal or we get a substantial part of what we want. Choice now is in Brussels. Choice is in Brussels. The British state has painted itself into a corner thanks to Theresa May. There is no room for compromise in London.
It was a long discussion. I believe it could be even longer if we were not running out of time. Thank you all for coming to discuss and to listen to Dr. Sean Gapp's thoughts. Let me thank you, Sean Gapp, for delivering his speech and discussing with you. Please do follow our Facebook. We will also publish the outline of the today's speech on our website. So you are welcome to read it afterwards and maybe to think twice about the things we were discussing today. Thank you again and have a nice evening.
A very good audience.
Good speaker.
Thanks.